On September 30th, 1941, in the pre-dawn gloom, German tanks moved forward. Operation Typhoon had begun. The decision for the final push on Moscow had matured in Hitler's mind back in the summer, when Plan Barbarossa first began to falter. The capture of the Soviet capital was seen by the Führer as the key to victory in the Eastern Campaign before the onset of winter. After protracted battles near Smolensk and the successful encirclement of Soviet troops near Kiev, Hitler was convinced the Red Army was exhausted and incapable of serious resistance. "The enemy is broken and will never regain its strength," he declared to his generals in September. This fatal underestimation of the enemy became the first link in a chain of miscalculations. The Führer demanded the impossible from Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal von Bock, to encircle and destroy the last combat-ready Soviet units in gigantic cauldrons and triumphantly enter Moscow before the first snow. By the end of September 1941, a paradoxical situation had developed on the Soviet-German front. The Germans had achieved impressive victories, seizing vast territories and inflicting colossal losses on the Red Army. The success near Kiev was particularly significant, where over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled. However, the main goal of the Blitzkrieg, the swift defeat of the USSR, remained unattainable. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, received long-awaited reinforcements after the exhausting Smolensk battles. Guderian's tank units, previously sent south for the Kiev operation, had returned to it. Now, von Bock had 78 divisions at his disposal, including 14 tank and 8 motorized divisions, a powerful fist aimed at the Soviet capital. Soviet troops in the Moscow direction were a patchwork of battle-worn units and fresh but inexperienced reserves. The Western Front, under General Konev, Budyonny's Reserve Front, and Eremenko's Bryansk Front, numbered about 90 divisions, but many of them were significantly weakened. Zhukov, who had recently successfully led the defense of Leningrad, had not yet been transferred to the Moscow direction. The German command faced a strategic dilemma. The General Staff of the Army, led by Halder, insisted on concentrating efforts against Moscow. Hitler, however, had long leaned towards continuing the offensive south, to the oil fields of the Caucasus and industrial Donbass. Only the successes near Kiev and the approaching winter forced the Führer to change priorities. On September 6th, Directive No. 35 was signed, instructing Army Group Center to launch a decisive offensive on Moscow. The operation was codenamed Typhoon, a symbol of an irresistible natural force that was to sweep away the Soviet defense. The state of communications was also an important factor. German rear services struggled to supply troops on extended supply lines. Railways had different gauges, which required transshipment of all materials at the border. Automotive transport wore out on Russian roads, and spare parts were catastrophically scarce. Time was relentlessly working against the Wehrmacht. Each day brought winter closer, a season for which the German army was completely unprepared. Hitler had only a few weeks left to conclude the 1941 campaign with a decisive victory. On September 6, 1941, Directive No. 35 of the High Command of the Wehrmacht was signed at the Führer's headquarters. This document initiated the operation that was destined to be the last attempt at a blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union. The favorable situation that has arisen as a result of the double success near Kiev and Lake Ilmen allows for a decisive blow against the enemy before the onset of winter, read the directive's text. Operation Typhoon envisioned a classic German maneuver, a double encirclement. Two powerful pincers were to close east of the Vyazma, cutting off the main forces of the Western and Reserve fronts. Simultaneously, a second pair of pincers was to snap shut in the Bryansk region, encircling the troops of the Bryansk front. To the north of Moscow, Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group advanced, while to the south, Hoppner's 4th Panzer Group pushed forward. From the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group participated in the operation. The infantry formations of the 9th and 4th Field Armies were to complete the encirclement and destroy the Soviet troops in the pockets. The German command expected that, after the destruction of the enemy's main forces in 2 giant pockets, the path to Moscow would be open. The Wehrmacht's tank wedges were to rapidly advance to the USSR's capital and capture it before the onset of winter cold. German generals believed that with the fall of Moscow, the political, transport, and industrial center, the Soviet Union would lose its ability to offer organized resistance. After the defeat of the enemy grouping in the Moscow region, the war in the East will be won, asserted Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff of the Army. The German command expected to complete the operation in 3 to 4 weeks. According to their estimates, the Red Army had exhausted its reserves and would not be able to replenish its losses after the disaster near Kiev. Intelligence reported that on the Moscow axis, the Soviet command had only scattered and demoralized units. A distinctive feature of Operation Typhoon was the unprecedented concentration of armored vehicles. For the first time since the beginning of the war against the USSR, the Germans assembled 3 panzer groups for a single operation. Approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns. This was Hitler's last gamble for a lightning victory. By early October 1941, Army Group Center represented the most powerful strike force in the entire history of the Eastern Campaign. For the decisive push on Moscow, the German command concentrated 78 divisions, totaling 1,800,000 men. They had at their disposal about 1,700 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces and mortars, as well as air support, over 1,000 combat aircraft of the Luftwaffe's 2nd Air Fleet. 3 panzer groups, the 2nd under Guderian, the 3rd under Hoth, and the 4th under Hoppner, provided particular striking power to the group. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Germans concentrated so much armor in one direction. The tank formations were reinforced with units rested after the Kiev operation and received equipment replenishment. The Soviet troops opposing this armada were in a much more difficult position. The Western Front under Konev, Budyonny's Reserve Front, and Yeryomenko's Bryansk Front numbered about 800,000 men, 900 tanks, and 7,500 artillery pieces. Many divisions were bled white by previous battles, manned at 50 to 60%, and experienced a severe shortage of weaponry. Despite a numerical superiority in divisions, 90 against 78, Soviet troops were inferior to the enemy in all key parameters. The tank ratio was particularly critical, an almost twofold advantage for the Germans, with most Soviet vehicles being light, outdated models. The main problem of the Soviet defense was its insufficient depth. The main forces were concentrated in the first echelon. Reserves were insignificant. There were gaps between the fronts, and coordination between them was poorly organized. The Stavka of the High Command, lacking precise intelligence about the scale of the impending offensive, underestimated the threat. German soldiers entered Operation Typhoon with high morale. They had victories at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev behind them. Many believed that Moscow would be the last decisive battle before the conclusion of the Eastern Campaign. Soviet troops, despite heavy defeats, maintained their resilience and readiness to defend the capital to the last possibility. September 30th, 1941, became a turning point in the history of the Great Patriotic War. At 4 o'clock in the morning, as the pre-dawn fog still lay over the fields, tanks of Guderian's 2nd Group launched an offensive against the troops of the Bryansk Front. A powerful artillery strike fell upon the positions of General Gorodniansky's 13th Army. Operation Typhoon had begun. The offensive came as a complete surprise to the Soviet command. The intelligence of the Bryansk Front failed to timely identify the concentration of German troops. Front Commander General Eremenko received alarming data on the enemy's regrouping only the day before the offensive. But it was already too late to take serious countermeasures. The Panzerwaffe employed their favorite tactic. Tank wedges, supported by massive airstrikes, swiftly broke through the Soviet defenses at the junction of the 50th and 13th Armies. Particularly effective were the actions of General von Geyer's 24th Motorized Corps, which had advanced 15 kilometers by the end of the first day. Soviet troops found themselves in a critical situation. Communication between units was disrupted, and troop command was hampered. Army Commander Gorodniansky reported to the front headquarters. The enemy has broken through the defenses in the sector of the 152nd Division. There are no reserves to localize the breakthrough. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command did not immediately grasp the scale of the unfolding offensive. Even on the evening of September 30th, Moscow believed it was a localized enemy operation. Only when, the next day, October 1st, the main forces of Army Group Center went on the offensive, did it become clear that the Germans had launched a decisive offensive on the capital. By the end of the first day of Operation Typhoon, German tank divisions had advanced up to 25 kilometers deep, creating a threat of encirclement for significant forces of the Bryansk front. Soviet aviation attempted to counter the advancing columns, but the overwhelming superiority of the Luftwaffe in the air reduced these attempts to a minimum. The first day of Typhoon showed that, despite colossal losses in the summer and autumn, the Wehrmacht retained high striking power and the ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. Even more difficult trials awaited the Soviet troops ahead. The first 10 days of October 1941 went down in the history of the war as a period of the Wehrmacht's triumphant offensive. After Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group delivered a powerful blow to the Bryansk front, on October 2nd, the main forces of Army Group Center went on the offensive. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group and Hoppner's 4th Panzer Group struck a crushing blow against the positions of the Western and Reserve fronts. German panzer wedges broke through Soviet defenses in several sectors. Particularly successful were the actions of the 57th Motorized Corps, which rapidly advanced in the direction of the Vyazma. On the southern flank, Lemelson's 47th Motorized Corps broke through to the area of Spazdemensk. The Soviet command failed to organize effective countermeasures against these tank breakthroughs. By October 6th, the German panzer pincers closed east of the Vyazma. 6 armies of the Western and Reserve fronts, a total of about 600,000 men, found themselves in a gigantic cauldron. Simultaneously, west of Bryansk, a second encirclement ring closed, trapping the main forces of the Bryansk front, about 350,000 men. The encircled Soviet troops made desperate attempts to break out of the cauldrons. Commander of the Western Front, General Konev, tried to organize a breakthrough to the east, but the dense ring of German troops and the lack of coordination between the encircled units made these attempts largely ineffective. Army Commander Lukin, with the remnants of the 19th Army, fought his way through German roadblocks, but most of his soldiers perished or were taken prisoner. The scale of the German success was staggering. By mid-October, the Wehrmacht had captured about 670,000 Soviet soldiers and officers, and seized thousands of units of military equipment. German generals celebrated victory, believing that the defense of Moscow had finally collapsed. Field Marshal von Bock reported to headquarters, "The battle near Vyazma can be considered the greatest encirclement battle in this war." However, even at this critical moment, some of the encircled Soviet troops continued to fight, tying up significant enemy forces. These battles in encirclement, although they ended in the death of most of the defenders, had strategic importance. They bought precious time for organizing defenses on the immediate approaches to Moscow. October 7, 1941 became a day of severe crisis for the Soviet leadership. Morning reports from the front left no doubt. The catastrophe was reaching an unprecedented scale. The encirclement of the main forces of the Western, Reserve, and Bryansk fronts created a gaping breach in the Moscow direction. Between the German tank wedges and the capital, only scattered units and hastily formed reserves remained. The path to Moscow was practically open. Stalin urgently summoned members of the State Defense Committee for an emergency meeting. The situation demanded immediate and decisive action. The first key decision was the appointment of Army General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov as commander of the Western Front. The previous evening, he had been urgently recalled from Leningrad, where he had successfully organized the city's defense on the Neva. A short conversation with Stalin took place that night. Moscow is in danger. The Germans have broken through the front. Konev is not coping. Go immediately. Such was the essence of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's order. Zhukov flew to the front literally an hour after that conversation. Upon arriving at the headquarters of the Western Front, he found complete confusion and a lack of reliable information about the troops' situation. Communication with the encircled armies was maintained sporadically, and data on the enemy was fragmentary. Zhukov acted decisively and harshly. His first order was to create a new line of defense at the Mozhaisk line. All available reserves were hastily transferred here. Cadets from military schools, rear units, remnants of divisions that had avoided encirclement. Simultaneously, the State Defense Committee adopted a resolution. On the introduction of a state of siege in Moscow, the capital was placed under martial law. A curfew was introduced, and battalions of the People's Militia were formed. Muscovites began building defensive lines, anti-tank ditches, pillboxes, barricades. Within a few days, a system of fortifications arose around the city, which had to be defended to the last possibility. On October 16th, panic began in Moscow. Rumors spread about the imminent fall of the city, and crowds of people rushed to the train stations. At this critical moment, Stalin decided to remain in the capital, although some government institutions and the diplomatic corps were evacuated to Kuibyshev. On November 7th, against all odds, a traditional military parade took place on Red Square. Troops went directly from the parade to the front, which was only a few tens of kilometers from the city. This symbolic act had immense psychological significance, demonstrating the Soviet leadership's determination to fight to the end. Meanwhile, Zhukov carried out titanic work to restore the front. His harshness bordered on cruelty. Panic and unauthorized abandonment of positions were met with a tribunal. But it was this inflexibility, combined with organizational talent, that allowed a new line of defense to be created in the shortest possible time. Fresh, well-equipped divisions were transferred from Siberia and the Far East to defend the capital. They arrived by echelons and immediately entered battle. The Soviet command mobilized all available resources to save the capital. Mid-October brought the Germans an unexpected obstacle, one not accounted for in the brilliant plans of the general staff. Heavy leaden clouds covered the sky, and incessant rains poured down. The famous Russian Rasputitsa began, a season when roads turn into impassable mud streams. For the mechanized formations of the Wehrmacht, this became a true nightmare. Tank columns, which had recently advanced rapidly, now struggled to cover a few kilometers a day. Dirt roads, washed out by the rains, turned into a viscous mire in which even tracked vehicles got stuck. Wheeled vehicles completely lost the ability to move independently. German soldiers joked bitterly. Russia has not two but three problems: fools, roads, and rains. The supply of advancing units was threatened with disruption. Motor transport could not deliver ammunition, fuel, and provisions to the front. Tanks and armored personnel carriers stood without fuel, artillery without shells. Soldiers began to experience food shortages. Horses, which the Wehrmacht used for transporting goods, were exhausted trying to pull carts out of the mud. The Rasputitsa struck the German army at the most inopportune moment, when only a few tens of kilometers remained to Moscow. The pace of the offensive catastrophically dropped. If in the first week of Operation Typhoon, German troops advanced 30 to 40 kilometers a day, now they barely covered 3 to 4 kilometers. For the Soviet command, this pause became an invaluable gift of fate. Zhukov gained precious time to organize defenses on the near approaches to the capital. While German tanks spun their wheels in the mud, fresh reserves from Siberia and the Far East were pulled up to Moscow. The psychological effect of the Rasputitsa proved no less significant than the tactical. German soldiers, accustomed to quick victories, for the first time encountered a situation where nature proved stronger than the military machine of the Third Reich. The morale of the troops began to fall. Anxiety grew at the headquarters of Army Group Center. Field Marshal von Bock wrote in his diary, "The weather has become our main adversary. If the rains do not stop in the coming days, the operation may be threatened with disruption." The Mozhaisk defense line became the last frontier separating German troops from Moscow. In mid-October 1941, when the main forces of the Western and Reserve fronts were encircled, it was here that the rapidly advancing enemy was to be stopped. This line of fortifications, the construction of which began back in the summer, stretched for 120 kilometers from Volokholamsk through Mozhaisk to Maloyaroslavets. Now it was to withstand the onslaught of 3 Wehrmacht tank groups. General Zhukov, who took command of the Western Front at a critical moment, understood. The loss of this line meant an open road to Moscow. He threw all available reserves onto the Mozhaisk line. 5 fresh rifle divisions, transferred from Siberia and the Far East, occupied key defensive sectors. A special role was played by the 116th Rifle Division of Major General Ivan Panfilov, which took up positions on the Volokholamsk direction. On October 12, advanced units of the German 4th Tank Group reached the Mozhaisk defense line. The first blow was taken by cadets of the Podolsk military schools near the Ilyinsky sector. 7,000 18-year-old youths, many of whom were holding weapons for the first time, delayed the advance of German tanks for 5 days. Only 1 out of 10 cadets returned from these positions. A no less dramatic battle unfolded on the Volokholamsk direction. Panfilov's division, together with General Dovator's cavalry group, held back the onslaught of the 46th Wehrmacht Tank Corps. The Germans threw up to 200 tanks into battle simultaneously, but the Soviet soldiers stood to the death. It was here that the 28 Panfilov guardsmen, who destroyed 18 German tanks near the Dubosekovo Razjezd, performed their feat. Near Mozhaisk, the 16th Army Corps of General Rokossovsky held the defense. Arriving at the positions with the remnants of his troops who had broken out of the Vyazma cauldron, Rokossovsky managed to organize an effective anti-tank defense. German tanks, trying to break through along the Minsk highway, repeatedly ran into anti-tank barriers and artillery fire. The Maloyaroslavets direction was defended by the 43rd Army of General Golubev. Here, too, the Germans failed to achieve decisive success. Soviet troops, using advantageous positions in the hilly terrain, repelled attack after attack. Even when the Germans broke through in individual sectors, counterattacks by reserves restored the situation. The battles on the Mozhaisk defense line continued until the end of October. Despite numerical superiority and better armament, German troops were unable to achieve a quick breakthrough. The pace of their offensive fell catastrophically. If at the beginning of Operation Typhoon they advanced 30 to 40 kilometers a day, now they barely covered 2 to 3 kilometers. By the end of October 1941, the offensive of Army Group Center came to a forced halt. The impassable roads and the heroic resistance of Soviet troops on the Mozhaisk defensive line compelled Field Marshal von Bock to stop the advance and regroup his forces. In the headquarters of Army Group Center, there were mixed feelings, from optimism to growing alarm. General Halder noted in his diary, "Despite tactical successes, the strategic goal of the operation has not yet been achieved. Time is working against us." The German command faced a difficult choice: either immediately continue the offensive with available forces, or wait for improved weather conditions and bring up the rear. Von Bock insisted on a short pause for regrouping. "We need to restore supplies to forward units and give the men a rest. Tanks need repairs. Many vehicles have broken down due to off-road conditions," he reported to the Führer's headquarters. Logistical problems reached a critical level. Railways could not handle the load. Different track gauges required all materials to be reloaded at the border. Motor transport bogged down in the mud. According to calculations by the quartermaster services, no more than 30% of necessary supplies reached the forward units. The technical condition of armored vehicles caused particular concern. Of the 1,700 tanks that began Operation Typhoon, fewer than 800 remained in service by the end of October. The rest required repairs or were irretrievably lost. Repair crews worked around the clock, but spare parts were critically scarce. German soldiers, who had recently been confident of a swift victory, encountered the harsh reality of the Russian autumn. Soaked greatcoats did not protect against the cold. Boots fell apart in the mud. Cases of colds and frostbite became more frequent, the first signs of the approaching winter, for which the Wehrmacht was completely unprepared. Meanwhile, heated discussions continued at Hitler's headquarters. General Jodl and Field Marshal Keitel insisted on continuing the offensive at any cost. Moscow must be taken before winter. Otherwise, the 1941 campaign will not achieve its goal. The Führer shared this position, demanding one last effort from the troops. Luftwaffe intelligence reported a continuous flow of Soviet reserves arriving in Moscow from the east. This caused growing concern. "The Russians are throwing fresh divisions into battle while our units are exhausted," General Halder noted. Despite all difficulties, the German command developed a plan for the final stage of Operation Typhoon. It was planned to encircle Moscow from the north and south, creating new pincer movements. The 3rd Panzer Group was to advance through Klin to Dimitrov, the 4th through Tula to Kolomna. Infantry units were tasked with a frontal assault on the capital. The first frosts, which hardened the ground in early November, instilled new hope in the German command. "The mud will no longer be our enemy. Now we can resume the offensive," Von Bock optimistically declared. No one in the German command yet realized that the Russian winter would prove to be a far more formidable adversary than the autumn impassability. Mid-November 1941 saw the resumption of the German offensive on Moscow. The first frosts solidified the muddy roads, turning impassable mire into a firm surface. Wehrmacht tanks and vehicles regained their mobility. Field Marshal von Bock received the long-awaited opportunity for a decisive thrust on the Soviet capital. The last chance to take Moscow before the onset of real winter was how Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff of the Army, characterized the situation. On November 15th, Wehrmacht strike groups launched an offensive along the entire front. The plan for the second phase of Operation Typhoon envisioned a classic double envelopment. Hot's 3rd Panzer Group struck from the northwest through Klin and Solnechnogorsk, aiming to reach the Moscow-Volga Canal near Dimitrov. Hopner's 4th Panzer Group was to break through Istra and Krasnaya Polyana to the northeastern outskirts of the capital. On the southern flank, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, recently renamed from a group, advanced through Tula to Kolomna. The German command intended to close the encirclement ring east of Moscow, cutting off the city from main communications with the rest of the country. In the northern direction, the Germans achieved significant success. Breaking through the defenses of the 30th Army, Hoth's tank divisions captured Klin on November 20th and Solnechnogorsk on November 23rd. Soviet troops retreated, suffering heavy losses. Rokossovsky, commander of the 16th Army, reported to Zhukov, "The situation is critical. The enemy is outflanking us. There are no reserves." A particularly dangerous situation developed in the Istra direction. German tanks broke through to the Istra Reservoir, the last serious natural barrier before Moscow. the Soviet command made the difficult decision to open the dam to hinder the enemy's advance. Streams of icy water poured onto the positions of advancing German units, slowing their progress. On November 28th, forward Wehrmacht units reached the Moscow-Volga Canal in the Yakroma area. Less than 30 kilometers remained to the capital. From the south, the situation developed no less dramatically. Guderian, unable to take the well-fortified Tula, bypassed the city from the east. His tanks broke through to Kashira, creating a threat of outflanking Moscow from the southeast. Only a counterattack by General Belov's 1st Guards Cavalry Corps drove the Germans back from this important transport hub. In all directions, Soviet troops fought with incredible courage. The cadets of the Kremlin regiment at the village of Kryukovo, Katukov's tankmen near Istra, and Smirnov's anti-tank regiment artillerymen on the Volokolamsk highway conducted a heroic defense. Thousands of fighters emulated the feat of the Panfilovtsi, holding back the onslaught of German tanks. By early December, the German offensive had run out of steam. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Wehrmacht equipment, not adapted to such conditions, began to fail en masse. Soldiers in summer uniforms suffered from frostbite. The front line stabilized just 20 to 30 kilometers from Moscow. The second phase of Operation Typhoon, like the first, did not achieve its main goal: the capture of the Soviet capital. The Wehrmacht's last chance was lost. Operation Typhoon went down in history as a classic example of strategic miscalculations in military planning. The German command made a series of fatal errors, each of which individually could have significantly complicated the offensive, and collectively, they led to complete failure. The first and most serious miscalculation was the catastrophic underestimation of Soviet mobilization capabilities. Hitler and his generals sincerely believed that after the severe defeats of the summer and autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union had exhausted its human and material resources. "The enemy has thrown his last reserves into battle," Franz Halder confidently declared in September. Reality turned out to be completely different. Dozens of fresh divisions were forming beyond the Urals, continuously being transferred to Moscow. The second fatal miscalculation was logistical unpreparedness. Advancing deep into Soviet territory, German troops were increasingly cut off from their supply bases. The difference in railway gauge between the European and Soviet systems required transshipment of all materials at the border. Motor transport wore out on Russian roads, and spare parts were catastrophically scarce. As a result, by early November, advanced units were receiving only 30% of the necessary supplies. The third critical error was the complete unreadiness for a winter campaign. Hitler was so confident in a quick victory that he forbade even considering the possibility of a protracted war. When the first frosts hit in November, German soldiers found themselves in summer uniforms. Tanks and vehicles lacked antifreeze, weapons froze, and batteries failed. "We are fighting not only against the Russian army, but also against the Russian winter," one Wehrmacht officer bitterly wrote. The fourth miscalculation was the dispersal of forces. Even during Operation Typhoon, the German command failed to concentrate on the main direction. Instead of throwing all forces directly at Moscow, Hitler demanded simultaneous advances north to Kalinin and south to Tula. As a result, a decisive advantage could not be achieved in any single direction. Finally, the fifth and perhaps most fundamental error was ideological prejudice. The Nazi doctrine of racial superiority and the perception of Slavs as subhumans led to a fatal underestimation of the enemy. Hitler and his entourage could not entertain the thought that the Bolshevik system was capable of effectively mobilizing resources and organizing resistance. This ideological blindness prevented a sober assessment of the situation, even when the facts indicated otherwise. By early December 1941, the opposing armies found themselves in a state of extreme exhaustion, but with different prospects. The Wehrmacht, halted just 20 kilometers from Moscow, had exhausted its offensive potential. Panzer divisions, which formed the striking force of Army Group Center, had lost up to 80% of their armored vehicles. Of the 1,700 tanks that began Operation Typhoon, fewer than 300 remained in service. The rest were either destroyed in combat or rendered inoperable due to technical reasons. Mechanisms froze in the 30-degree frost, for which German equipment was not adapted. The Wehrmacht's infantry divisions suffered equally heavy losses. Most regiments were only 40 to 50% staffed. Many companies numbered 20 to 30 men instead of the prescribed 150. Reinforcements arrived irregularly and in insufficient quantities. The supply situation was catastrophic. Stretched communications, destroyed roads, and railway tracks with different gauges created insurmountable difficulties for logistics services. Soldiers at the front received half rations, and there was a shortage of warm clothing, medicines, and ammunition. Frostbite became a mass phenomenon. Hospitals were overflowing with cold-affected casualties. Soviet troops, although they suffered enormous losses, were in a fundamentally different position. Behind them stood Moscow, the country's largest transport hub, through which reinforcements flowed continuously from the east. Zhukov methodically accumulated strategic reserves. By early December, he had 5 fresh armies at his disposal, transferred from Siberia and the Far East. The Siberian divisions, manned by experienced fighters and adapted to winter conditions, drastically changed the balance of power. Soviet industry, evacuated beyond the Urals, began to increase arms production. T-34 tanks, artillery pieces, mortars, and PPSH submachine guns were continuously brought to the front line. Katyusha rocket launchers proved particularly effective in winter conditions, striking terror into German infantry. The morale of the opposing armies also differed strikingly. German soldiers, buoyed by the easy victories of summer and autumn, now faced the harsh reality of the Russian winter. Notes of despair and hopelessness increasingly appeared in their letters home. Soviet troops, despite severe trials, felt that the enemy had been stopped, and the initiative was gradually shifting to them. On December 5th, Zhukov reported to Stalin that he was ready for a counteroffensive. The beginning of December 1941 was marked by the last desperate attempts of the Wehrmacht to break through to Moscow. The German command, realizing that time was working against them, threw all available reserves into battle. In the northern direction, near Dmitrov, Goth's 3rd Panzer Group launched a decisive offensive, striving to force the Moscow-Volga Canal. Simultaneously, in the southwestern direction, near Narofominsk, Hoppner's 4th Panzer Group tried to break through the defenses of Panfilov's 1st Guards Motorized Rifle Division. However, nature finally turned its back on the invaders. The thermometer showed 35 degrees below zero. Such frost became a real catastrophe for German equipment. Oil in tank engines solidified, turning into a thick paste. Batteries lost charge, starters didn't work. Every morning, German tank crews had to light bonfires under their vehicles to somehow warm up the engines. Many tanks simply wouldn't start and became easy prey for Soviet anti-tank crews. The situation with personnel was no better. Wehrmacht soldiers, dressed in light greatcoats, suffered massively from frostbite. Alarming phrases increasingly appeared in German commanders' reports. Morale is falling. People fear the cold more than the Russians. More frostbitten than wounded in battle. The commander of the 46th Panzer Division reported, "My soldiers cannot hold their weapons with frozen hands." In contrast, Soviet troops were much better prepared for winter conditions. Red Army soldiers had warm padded jackets, felt boots, and ear-flap hats. Siberian divisions, accustomed to the harsh climate, felt in their element. Their ski battalions easily bypassed clumsy German units, striking from the flanks and rear. The last days before the Soviet counteroffensive became a period of gradual transition of initiative. German attacks became increasingly sluggish and fruitless. Tanks breaking through to Soviet positions often stopped due to frozen fuel and became easy prey for artillerymen. The Luftwaffe aviation, previously dominant in the air, now rarely appeared. Aircraft engines refused to work in the frost. On December 5, 1941, the German offensive finally ran out of steam. Field Marshal von Bock reported to Hitler's headquarters, "The troops have reached the limit of their physical and moral capabilities. Continuing the offensive under these conditions is impossible." On the same day, Zhukov presented Stalin with a counteroffensive plan, which was immediately approved. Operation Typhoon ended without achieving its main goal. German troops, stopped 20 kilometers from Moscow, now found themselves under threat of defeat. Hitler's dream of a blitzkrieg finally collapsed in the snows of the Moscow region. Operation Typhoon became a turning point not only in the Battle of Moscow, but in the entire Second World War. The failure of the last German thrust towards the Soviet capital negated the blitzkrieg strategy and turned the Eastern Campaign into a protracted war of attrition, which Germany could not win. The lessons of this battle proved bitter for the Wehrmacht and salvific for the Soviet Union. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the myth of the invincibility of the German war machine was destroyed. An army that conquered almost all of Europe in a matter of months proved powerless against a combination of natural factors, the resilience of Soviet soldiers, and the strategic genius of the command. History repeated itself with astonishing accuracy. Like Napoleon in 1812, Hitler underestimated Russia's vastness, the severity of its climate, and the people's determination to defend their land. Both dictators made a fatal mistake by starting the campaign too late and without preparing for winter. Both stopped at the gates of Moscow, lacking the strength for a decisive thrust. The failure of Typhoon led to serious reshuffles in the German command. Hitler, enraged by the failure, removed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch from the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Army and took direct command of the Army himself. Field Marshal von Bock was removed from his position as commander of Army Group Center. Dozens of generals were dismissed. The Führer no longer trusted his military leaders, and from that moment on, increasingly interfered in operational planning, which only exacerbated Germany's strategic errors. For the Soviet command, the victory near Moscow became invaluable experience. Zhukov and other military leaders learned important lessons from the fierce battles of the autumn and winter of '41. Tank tactics were revised, inter-branch cooperation was improved, and methods of countering German tank wedges were refined. This experience formed the basis of future Red Army victories. The failure of Operation Typhoon also had immense international significance. Japan, observing the course of battles near Moscow, abandoned plans to attack the USSR from the Far East and focused on the war against the USA and Great Britain. The American government, convinced of the Soviet Union's ability to continue the fight, significantly expanded the Lend-Lease military aid program. The key factors that predetermined the failure of Typhoon were the strategic miscalculations of the German command, the underestimation of the USSR's mobilization capabilities, unpreparedness for the winter campaign, stretched communications, and of course, the heroism of Moscow's defenders. Each of these factors played its role, but it was their combination that led to the collapse of German plans. The Battle of Moscow proved that even the most powerful war machine is powerless against a people fighting for their land.